Four brothers named Blackwood showed remarkable immunity that defied medical explanation during the summer of 1878, when typhoid illness killed 47 citizens of Harper County, Kansas. However, the price they paid for their survival was so hideous that 3 different doctors declined to record their findings, and the Kansas State Medical Board secretly destroyed all case-related documents. What began as supernatural protection turned into something much darker. A change so unsettling that the local Methodist Church expunged all reference to the Blackwood family from its archives. No medical literature had ever explained the symptoms the brothers experienced, and they became increasingly inhumane every day. By winter, the brothers' eyes reflected light like nocturnal predators. Their voices had taken on harmonic properties that made listeners' ears bleed, and they no longer cast correct shadows, according to neighbors. It is said that the final medical report, which is still classified, stated, "Subjects have transcended human biological classification before all documentation was permanently sealed. The truth about the Blackwood brothers may be more terrible than any supernatural explanation, and tonight, after over 150 years of silence, we're going to discover why contemporary science still denies what happened on that remote property." I have a crucial question for you before we move on to the tale of Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood. Only the most courageous individuals who dare to solve the riddles that others are afraid to reveal are welcome on this channel. Hit the subscribe button and tell me in the comments whatever state or city you're listening from if you're one of those real mystery seekers. Will you have the courage to discover the truth about the collision between science and faith on the Kansas prairie? Let's go back to 1878. A time when fear and faith coexisted. In the late 1872s, the tiny farming village of Cedar Ridge, Kansas, was little more than a junction of cow ranches and wheat fields. It was the kind of place where a man's word was his bond, where everyone knew each other's business, and where Sunday worship at the Methodist Church functioned as both a social gathering and a source of spiritual instruction, with only 300 individuals dispersed across the windswept prairie. The fierce summers that might destroy crops in a week, and the severe winters that brought blizzards that could bury entire homesteads, had created a populace of stoic, devout individuals who saw adversity as a test from God, and wealth as a gift from God. Such thought appeared to be encouraged by the scenery itself. With the exception of the occasional farmhouse, windmill, or grove of cottonwood trees denoting a creek bed, miles of golden wheat extended to every horizon. Everything was dominated by the sky, which was huge, limitless, and always shifting. Lightning would dance across the prairie for hours during thunderstorms, illuminating the grassland in short, bright flashes that showed how isolated each farmstead really was. The wind, which carried snow and cold that might kill a man in minutes if he lost his way between barn and home, howled across the flatlands in the winter with a voice that seemed almost human. The Blackwood brothers had come to Cedar Ridge in the spring of 1872, using funds they inherited from their father's farm in Clinton County, Ohio, to buy 640 acres of desirable prairie property. With the resolve of men who have been called by God, the brothers had sold everything they owned, packed their possessions into 2 covered wagons, and set out westward. At 36 when they came, Ezra Blackwood was the oldest and had the innate authority of a man used to responsibility and leadership. He was 6 feet tall and had strong shoulders from years of working on the farm. He exuded a quiet nobility that demanded respect without asking for it. His grizzled hands, marred by innumerable hours of work, were equally adept at guiding a plow or soothing a frightened horse. His eyes, which were as colorless as winter ice and appeared to see straight through people to something deeper, were what people recalled most, though. After speaking with Ezra, many people felt as though he had peeled right into their souls and discovered their shortcomings. The family's business manager and practical thinker was Caleb, who was 2 years younger than Ezra. Caleb oversaw with meticulous planning and mathematical accuracy, but Ezra led with moral authority. Even the county's most seasoned farmers were impressed by his accuracy in predicting weather patterns, animal prices, and grain harvests. Every cent made and spent, every bushel harvested, and every head of cattle purchased or sold were all recorded in his ledger books, which were meticulously handwritten. Beneath his pragmatic appearance, however, was the same deep faith that drove all the brothers. Caleb recognized God's hand in everything, including the mathematical harmony that regulated the natural world, the exact timing of rainfall, and the flawless geometry of a wheat field. Of the 4 brothers, Josiah III was the most educated at age 31. Before being called back to the family farm due to the death of their father, he had spent 2 years at Ohio Wesleyan University. He had studied philosophy, medicine, the scientific sciences, and theology during that time. His personal library, which included more than 200 titles on everything from human anatomy to biblical interpretation, was carefully moved to Kansas in a specially constructed crate. Josiah's room in the farmhouse was more like a scholar's study than a farmer's quarters, with wooden boxes under his bed filled with papers he had meticulously noted and books piled on every available surface. At 25, Abel was the youngest and blazed with a religious zeal that occasionally worried even his religiously inclined siblings. Abel's religion was based on pure passion and complete surrender, in contrast to the older brothers who approached their devotion with academic depth or real-world application. He prayed for hours every day, and the depth of his spiritual connection frequently brought him to tears. He said that scripture and prayer gave all the sustenance he required, and he fasted frequently, sometimes lasting days without eating. While his fellow Ohioans had referred to him as touched by the Spirit, others had muttered that his dedication verged on hazardous fanaticism. The Blackwood brothers had built their own chapel on a hilltop overlooking their property, in contrast to their neighbors who went to the town's Methodist church, a simple white-painted structure with a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the prairie. They had spent the most of their first year in Kansas working on the building project. They had chopped oak timber from a grove close to the property border, quarried limestone from a creek bed on their property, and built every component of the building by hand. Their austere yet fervent religion was mirrored in the chapel they constructed. The building was 30 feet by 20 feet, with hand-split oak shingles for the roof and carefully fitted limestone walls. Pews made of local walnut wood were carved inside, and each one was flawlessly smooth and fitted with meticulous joinery that revealed hours of patient craftsmanship. The altar was similarly crafted by hand and included Hebrew inscriptions that Josiah had copied from his Bible. During their dawn and dusk prayers, the room was flooded with golden light from the tall windows on the east and west sides that let in the morning and evening Sunday. Following what they referred to as primitive Methodist principles, a more stringent interpretation of Wesley's teachings that placed an emphasis on individual revelation, direct communication with God, and the priesthood of all believers. The brothers conducted their own services every Sunday morning and evening. Longer stretches of solitary prayer, in-depth biblical study, and what they dubbed testimony of the Spirit, in which each brother shared any insights or revelations he had received from God during the week, were also part of their services. Their dedication to work and faith was evident in their everyday routine. Every morning at 4, they got up and spent an hour in the chapel, praying in silence while they watched the sun rise over the eastern prairie and had a private conversation with God. They would labor in their fields in the morning after a basic breakfast consisting of bread, milk, and whatever fruit was in season. The afternoons were spent caring for the animals, maintaining the machinery, and performing the innumerable chores necessary to keep a farm running. However, the evening was always set out for spiritual activities, such as group prayer, theological discussion, and Bible study, which frequently continued until after midnight. Though their choice had not been free, the brothers lived as bachelors, giving their all to their property and their faith. Their farmhouse, a solid 2-story building they had constructed in their second year in Kansas, was a testament to their strong religious beliefs and practical outlook on life. Biblical passages carved onto wooden plaques were posted on the walls. Each one was chosen for its significance to everyday farm life and spiritual development. There was at least one well-worn Bible in each room, and several others held other holy writings that Josiah had decided were important enough to read on a regular basis. The Blackwood farm was a shining example of both agricultural achievement and spiritual commitment by the summer of 1878. Their chapel stood as a tribute to their everlasting faith, Their silo bulged with grain, their cattle grazed happily on healthy pasture, and their wheat fields extended bright across the prairie. 6 years prior, when the brothers left Ohio, they had hoped for independence, affluence, and the opportunity to practice their religion as they saw fit. Although many found the Blackwood brothers' intensity unnerving and their alienation from the community perplexing, their neighbors in Cedar Ridge held them in high regard. In addition to their reputation for hard labor and treating the odd hired hand they hired during harvest season fairly, the brothers were recognized for their honesty in business dealings and their readiness to assist neighbors in distress. However, they were also notorious for their reluctance to attend social events, their reticence to strike up a conversation, and their propensity to judge everyone they encountered with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right into someone's soul. The brothers moved with silent purpose and spoke only when necessary when they came to town for supplies, which they did with military precision every 2 weeks. They would bring a well-prepared list to the general store, do their business with courteous speed, and go without the social chit-chat that other farmers took pleasure in. Youngsters frequently gazed in wonder at the brothers' 4 matching beards, which were coal black and expertly trimmed, giving them an almost biblical appearance. On the 15th of July, 1878, the first recorded case of typhoid fever occurred at Cedar Ridge, exhibiting the abrupt fury typical of the disease's most virulent strains. When the general store opened that morning, Mrs. Sarah Hartman, who owned it with her husband Benjamin, had appeared to be in excellent health, welcoming customers with her customary smile and talking about the wheat harvest's bright future. However, by the afternoon, she was raging with fever and had the distinctive rose-colored patches on her skin that seasoned doctors knew were a sign of typhoid. The only doctor in the county, Dr. Samuel Morrison, had been called in from his rounds at the Henderson farm, where he had spent the majority of the day giving birth to a breech baby. Sarah was delirious with a fever when he arrived at the Hartman store. Her temperature was so high that it hardly registered on his clinical thermometer. Benjamin, her spouse, who is typically composed and pragmatic, was pacing the store like a shackled animal, wringing his hands and pleading with Dr. Morrison to take any action to save his wife of 23 years. Benjamin shouted in desperation, "Doctor, she was fine this morning," over and over, "fine as she's ever been." Served breakfast to the Henderson boys when they came for supplies, laughed at something young Tommy said about his new foal. "How does a person go from healthy to this in the space of a few hours, doctor?" During his medical studies in Philadelphia, Morrison had already encountered typhoid, but this case was unlike any he had ever seen. Usually, the illness progressed over a period of days or weeks, allowing doctors to try treatments and families to get ready for the inevitable end. However, the entire course of the illness seems to have been condensed into one terrible day in Sarah Hartman's instance. Her madness was total and severe. Her fever was higher than he had ever seen in a living patient, and the rose-colored spots covered her entire body, not just her chest, in patterns that seemed almost purposeful in their symmetry. Sarah Hartman passed away shortly after midnight on July 16th, despite Dr. Morrison's best efforts, which included applying cold compresses, giving her laudanum for the agony, and closely monitoring her vital signs. However, her case was still quite problematic long after she passed away. Her body became hard far too rapidly. Her eyes, which Dr. Morrison had closed properly, kept opening again no matter how many times he squeezed the lids shut, and her complexion had a waxy pallor that suggested preservation rather than normal decomposition. 3 further cases surfaced in Cedar Ridge within 24 hours after Sarah's passing. Except for using the town's primary well, which had supplied the population with sweet, clean water from its inception, the victims appeared to have nothing in common. However, when examining the well, Dr. Morrison discovered traces of contamination from runoff that had somehow gotten past the meticulously built stone lining. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German immigrant who had been farming the same plot of land for 15 years, was the second casualty. Sarah's case and Heinrich's followed the same tragic pattern: morning health, afternoon fever, and death before dawn. However, something that Dr. Morrison had never heard before characterized Heinrich's last hours. The elderly farmer used words and phrases that sounded archaic and somewhat menacing, and he spoke in languages that no one in the town knew. Emma and Ellen Patterson, two 16-year-old twins who had been among the most promising pupils in the county's only schoolhouse, were the third and fourth fatalities. Their deaths were especially tragic, since they happened at the same time, as though the illness had planned its attack to take both girls at the same time. In their last delirium, the twins spoke in perfect unison, reciting what sounded like prayers in a language that resembled Latin but contained sounds that human throats should not have been able to produce. Their father, James Patterson, later informed Dr. Morrison. The peculiar strain of typhoid had killed 14 persons by August 1st, and Dr. Morrison had recorded progressions and symptoms that went against all medical discipline he had ever studied. The victims' fevers reached degrees that should have killed them in minutes. Their final hours were characterized by delirium that seemed more like possession than a medical emergency, and all of them passed away within 24 hours of exhibiting symptoms. There had never been a panic like the one that swept Cedar Ridge during those awful weeks in late July and early August. Families shut themselves inside their houses, only going outside to do the most basic chores. Now, managed by Benjamin Hartman with his brother-in-law's assistance, the general shop turned into a scene of hushed discussions and sly looks. During Sunday services, the Methodist Church, which had long been a hub for the town and a place of solace, was almost deserted because people were afraid that any congregation could bring in new patients for the disease. The disease persisted in spreading in a manner that suggested something more than simple contamination, despite Dr. Morrison's orders to close the infected well and boil the water for all households. The victims appeared to have been selected based on some reasoning that was unrelated to their closeness to prior occurrences or their exposure to the well water. While nearby households stayed perfectly healthy, some families lost every member. The Blackwood brothers' disastrous choice to become involved in the crisis was made against this terrifying and perplexing background. Following their custom of avoiding needless interaction with the town and its inhabitants, the brothers had stayed secluded on their property during the early weeks of the outbreak. However, Josiah called his brothers to action on August 10th, when he told them that he had received what he thought was a supernatural revelation. "I have prayed for guidance," Josiah stated to his brothers as they gathered for dinner. "And the Lord has shown me that this pestilence is a test not just of the community's faith, but of our own worthiness to serve as His instruments. We have been preserved from the disease not for our own safety, but so that we might demonstrate the power of true faith in the face of ultimate trial." Once the choice was decided, it was carried out with the same meticulous accuracy that marked all the brothers' actions. Josiah came to town on August 11th to donate their skills in caring for the sick and to offer Dr. Morrison their aid. His true intention, however, which he only told his brothers, was to come into close touch with the illness in order to allow it to try his faith and demonstrate his value as a tool of God's will. Josiah started by going to the house of Thomas Fletcher, a blacksmith in the area, whose 8-year-old son Timothy had become ill the night before. The boy's little body was tormented by convulsions that his parents were helpless to stop, and he was burning with fever. The Fletcher family was huddled around Timothy's bed, fervently hoping for divine intervention when Josiah arrived. Everyone who saw what transpired would recall it differently, but they all concurred that Josiah's actions were both profoundly poignant and unsettling in some way. Kneeling next to Timothy's bed, the youngest Blackwood brother put his hands on the boy's feverish forehead. But rather than saying a traditional prayer for the child's healing, Josiah said something that would haunt everyone in the room. "Lord God," Josiah prayed, his tone reverberating with a strange resonance, "if this child must suffer for reasons known only to your divine wisdom, then let that suffering pass through me and my brothers. Let us bear what he cannot bear, experience what he should not experience, and become whatever we must become to serve your mysterious purposes. Take this innocent life and spare it through our willing sacrifice." Josiah's hands appeared to warm up against Timothy's forehead as he spoke, and the boy's seizures eventually stopped. For the first time in hours, Timothy Fletcher opened his eyes and talked normally, requesting water and complaining of hunger as the fever that had been engulfing the child's little body started to subside. Thomas Fletcher bowed down in gratitude to God for the miracle that had spared his kid because the change was so abrupt and dramatic. However, many who observed Josiah during those pivotal moments saw alterations that were somewhat more unsettling than Timothy's recovery, albeit being far more subtle. Josiah had developed a blush on his own skin, indicating that his body temperature was increasing as the boy's fever subsided. Normally the same pale blue that defined all the Blackwood brothers, specks of gold appeared in his eyes, shifting and moving like liquid metal. When Josiah eventually rose from Timothy's bedside, he did so with the deliberate dexterity of a man struggling to keep his own body under control. With increasing bewilderment and alarm, Dr. Morrison, who had been sent to observe what the Fletchers were describing as a miracle, examined both Timothy and Josiah. Although there was no sign of typhoid fever in the youngster, Josiah had early symptoms that were already developing far more quickly than was medically advised. Josiah spent the next 2 days visiting all of the homes affected by the outbreak, providing the grieving families with spiritual support and prayers. He performed the same rite at every stop, putting his hands on the sick people's heads and asking God to transfer their sorrow to him and his brothers. In equal measure, the outcomes were both amazing and scary. Fever-stricken individuals recovered abruptly and completely in one family after another. However, Josiah's own health worsened more quickly with each recovery. When he eventually made it back to the Blackwood farm on August 13th, Josiah was exhibiting symptoms that no medical textbook had ever explained and was burning with fever. His persistent insistence that everything was happening in accordance with God's plan, however, was the most unsettling element. He spoke clearly about the sacredness of his metamorphosis, even as his fever ramped up to levels that should have killed him. "This is not sickness," he stated to his increasingly worried brothers. "This is purification. The Lord is burning away everything in me that is merely human, so that what remains will be worthy of the eternal work He has planned for us." The 4 Blackwood brothers had all started to exhibit the identical symptoms that had changed Josiah within a few hours, but their combined metamorphosis would turn out to be considerably more unsettling than anyone could have predicted. The Blackwood boys' initial examination by Dr. Morrison on the 18th of August, 1878, would turn out to be the most important and concerning case of his medical career. Dr. Morrison led his horse cart up the twisting dirt road to the Blackwood farm in the stifling August heat. Weeks without rain had rendered the prairie grass on either side of the roadway brown, and heat waves glistened in the air, making the farmhouse in the distance appear to float like a mirage. However, Morrison observed features that seemed strangely out of place as he got closer to the property. As though they had been receiving regular rainfall, the brothers' wheat fields, which ought to have been suffering from the drought like every other farm in the county, stood tall and green. Even though grazing has grown challenging across the region, the cattle on the pastures seemed robust and well-fed. Ezra answered the farmhouse door when Morrison knocked. However, the doctor was instantly struck by how severely wrong the oldest brother's appearance was. Ezra's skin had become translucent, exposing the blood vessel network underneath. However, the blood that passed through those veins had a golden luminosity that appeared to pulse with its own internal beat rather than the typical red of human circulation. When Ezra said, "Dr. Morrison," his voice had the power, Morrison recalled, but it was enhanced with harmonic overtones that gave the impression that each syllable was resonating right in the listener's chest. "We have been expecting you. Our transformation is nearly complete, and we require your witness to ensure that others will understand what has occurred here." Morrison discovered the 4 brothers arrayed in the farmhouse's main room, their bodies placed with mathematical accuracy that implied deliberate planning as opposed to haphazard arrangement. They were breathing, their eyes followed Morrison's movements, and their chests rose and sank. However, they had undergone changes that called into question his comprehension of human physiology. "Their vital signs are impossible," Morrison composed that evening in his personal journal. "Ezra's temperature registered 107 degrees Fahrenheit, yet he sits upright and speaks with perfect clarity. Caleb's pulse is so slow, I can barely detect it, yet he moves with normal energy. Josiah's breathing has changed. He seems to inhale and exhale only once every few minutes, but shows no signs of oxygen deprivation. and Abel's skin temperature is actually lower than normal despite his obvious fever symptoms. Caleb, standing on Ezra's right, had changed in ways that were just as profound yet distinct in their expression. His entire body was covered with the rose-colored spots that are characteristic of typhoid fever, but instead of the disease's usual haphazard pattern, the spots had ordered themselves into intricate geometric patterns that looked like mathematical equations written in blood and flesh. The design gradually morphed and shifted, while Morrison gazed in terror and amazement, as though Caleb's skin had turned into a living blackboard. "The calculations are becoming clear," Caleb stated, his voice perfectly harmonizing with Ezra's, even though they were speaking at the same time. "The relationship between matter and spirit, between time and eternity, between human limitation and divine potential. We are becoming the proof of theorems that human mathematics has only begun to glimpse." Josiah's metamorphosis had developed in a way that was consistent with his intellectual disposition and profound theological understanding. Although the basic structure of his body was still recognizable as human, his skin had taken on the look of ancient parchment, covered in writing and scripts that Morrison recognized as Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, as well as other symbols that appeared to change and evolve. While he watched, the voice that Josiah used to speak was no longer completely human. Morrison felt as though a choir of invisible speakers were speaking to him, since the sound appeared to come from several locations throughout the room at once. "Doctor, we have discovered truths that your medical science cannot accommodate. We are documenting these revelations so that future generations might understand the process of divine transformation." Of all the brothers, Abel, the youngest, had changed the most dramatically. His whole body radiated a gentle phosphorescent light that illuminated the interior of the room. It was a calm, blue-white glow that seemed to emanate from inside his bones, and while it was not harsh nor unpleasant, it was utterly alien. Instead of pupils or irises, his eyes were now entirely bright, resembling twin stars placed in a human face. Abel said, "We no longer require food as sustenance," and Morrison heard him say it from both within the room and what felt like a very long way away. "We draw our energy directly from sources that human science has not yet discovered. We are becoming something new, something that exists between the mortal and eternal realms." Morrison encountered opposition from the brothers themselves when he tried to record his findings. They asserted that their illness was a gift from God, an indication that they were selected for a particular mission. They described being polished by holy fire and changed into vessels that were appropriate for the purpose of the Lord. However, Dr. Morrison's background in medicine informed him otherwise. The brothers' collective metamorphosis suggested either mass hysteria or something more sinister, and their symptoms bore no resemblance to any known ailment. He started to believe that they had been exposed to an unidentified toxin, perhaps from tainted grain in their silo or from their well water. The brothers' condition elicited a varied and tense response from the community. According to the Methodist Church's Reverend Marcus Thorne, some locals believed their survival was miraculous. They started going to the Blackwood farm on pilgrimages in the hopes of seeing divine intervention for themselves. Others found the brothers' metamorphosis unsettling and strange, especially those who had lost family members to the pandemic. Jacob Steinberg murmured, "It ain't right. After burying his wife and 2 kids within a week, why should they be spared when good Christian folk are dying? And look at them, that ain't no blessing. I can see there's something wrong with those boys, something that makes my skin crawl just looking at them." The anxiety in the neighborhood was only heightened by the brothers' actions during this time. Despite their state, they kept working their fields, moving with a strange coordination that made it seem as though they were speaking without using words. For hours at a time, neighbors saw them standing still in their wheat fields, their faces turned to the sky, as though they were listening to an unintelligible voice. Particularly troubling were the modifications made to their chapel services. The brothers had always worshipped in solitude, but now, when they prayed in the evening, their voices could be heard over the plains. 4 voices, harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to generate, created a sound that was both eerily beautiful and utterly incorrect. Later, Dr. Morrison was informed by Mrs. Eleanor Patterson of the next farm that she had come to the chapel one evening to look into the peculiar music. "I got within 50 yards of that building," she stated, "and I swear on my mother's grave that I could feel something pushing me back, not physically, you understand, but something inside my head telling me to turn around and leave." "Those boys are changed, Doctor. Changed in ways that ain't natural." The typhoid outbreak at Cedar Ridge started to decline as August gave way to September. The surviving occupants gradually resumed their regular activities when the contaminated well was capped and fresh water sources were set up. However, the Blackwood brothers' puzzle grew more complex every day. Supposedly to keep an eye on the boys' health, Dr. Morrison visited the property once a week to record the brothers' metamorphosis. His knowledge of human physiology was called into question by what he saw, and he began to doubt his own sanity. Ezra did not exhibit any symptoms of organ failure or brain impairment, but his internal temperature had stabilized at 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit. His eyes had turned golden, and they swirled and shifted like liquid metal. Even when he said something that didn't make sense, his comments had such authority and weight that they forced listeners to agree with him. "Dr. Morrison," Ezra stated during a single test, "you are attempting to measure us using instruments designed for ordinary human physiology. We have moved beyond the limitations that such tools were created to assess. Our bodies now function according to principles that your medical science has not yet discovered." The rose-colored dots on Caleb's skin had developed into ever more intricate designs that mirrored old calligraphy. Dr. Morrison sent meticulous sketches of the markings to a number of academics for consultation, but none were able to decipher the symbols. Even more unsettling was the fact that the patterns appeared to gradually shift across Caleb's skin, changing positions every few days. Morrison found that Caleb's blood had been changed into something that hardly resembled typical human circulation when he tried to draw a sample from the brother's arm. The fluid that poured from the tiny puncture wound was golden, thicker than blood, and appeared to travel purposefully rather than in reaction to pressure and gravity. Caleb clarified, "Our circulation has been redesigned," as he observed Morrison's increasing bewilderment with what may have been laughter. "The fluid that sustains us now carries not just oxygen and nutrients, but information and energy from sources that transcend physical matter." Josiah's voice had turned into something wholly unhuman. It seemed as though his words were vibrating the air around him, and as he spoke, the sound simultaneously came from everywhere and nowhere. "Doctor." Morrison saw that he felt lightheaded and confused after talking to Josiah, and he started to believe that the brother's speech was influencing his brain chemistry in some way. Josiah's skin was covered in writings that were actively being written by an unseen entity rather than being static decorations. New words formed in real time along Josiah's arms and chest, creating phrases and paragraphs as Morrison watched. With a level of accuracy that suggested the brother could read Morrison's mind, the text appeared to be a running commentary on his examination, detailing his thoughts and emotions. With a multi-directional voice that made Morrison's head spin with dizziness, Josiah declared, "We are becoming books. Living repositories of knowledge that spans both human learning and divine revelation. The transformation is encoding information directly into our physical substance." Abel's phosphorescence had intensified to the point that the pale glow from his skin could light up entire rooms. His apparent capacity to sense things that should have been invisible to the human eye was more disturbing, though. He appeared to know when guests were coming to the farm long before they were visible, could find misplaced items without looking, and could forecast weather changes days in advance. Abel showed during one examination that he could see things that should have been outside the realm of human perception. He described in detail the state of horses stabled half a mile away, accurately identified Morrison's medical bag contents without opening it, and appeared to be aware of talks occurring in the town of Cedar Ridge, 3 miles away. Abel continued, "Our senses have been opened to perceive realities that normal humans cannot detect," his glowing eyes somehow conveying warmth despite their unearthly look. "We can see across distances that should be impossible, hear sounds that carry on frequencies beyond normal hearing." Additionally, there had been a shift in the brothers' aggregate conduct that suggested they were evolving beyond human characteristics. They responded to unsaid messages and completed each other's sentences with flawless synchronicity. They were much less hungry and far less sleepy. According to Dr. Morrison, They appeared to need only 2 or 3 hours of sleep per night and may have consumed half as many calories as other men. Their assertion that they were getting revelations from God was the most unsettling of all. The brothers related visions of their community's future, predictions of impending calamities, and directives to get their neighbors ready for an unspecified calamity. Using a script that looked like no known language, they started recording these insights in a leather-bound journal. Fear and mistrust gradually replaced the community's initial interest regarding the brothers' health. When adults saw the brothers in town, they fled, and children were not allowed to play close to the Blackwood property. After at first hailing their survival as a miracle, the Methodist Church started to turn away from the family. Once praising the brothers' religion, Reverend Thorne now spoke about them with hardly disguised discomfort. "I fear," he told Dr. Morrison, "that in their zeal to serve the Lord, they may have opened themselves to influences that are not entirely heavenly. There is something in their eyes now, something that looks back at you with knowledge that no mortal man should possess." The circumstances at the Blackwood farm became intolerable by October 1878. Their metamorphoses had advanced to the point where the brothers were no longer fully human, but they were still able to speak clearly and articulately about their predicament. They described themselves as vessels of purification, selected by God to act as bridges between the worlds of the divine and the mortal. The way that Dr. Morrison was documenting their condition had grown more desperate. His journal writings showed a man who was having difficulty upholding scientific rationalism in the face of unexplainable experiences. He had started communicating with medical colleagues in Chicago and Kansas City to get their opinions on the case, but their answers simply made him more irate. "No physician I've consulted has ever encountered anything resembling the Blackwood brothers' condition," he stated in his letter. "Their symptoms are physiologically impossible, yet I observe them with my own eyes. I begin to wonder if I am losing my mind, or if there are aspects of human biology that our medical science has yet to discover." When young Sarah Preston, the daughter of a local farmer, vanished while playing close to the Blackwood property on October 15th, it was the tipping point. 3 hours later, she was discovered by her parents sitting calmly in the brothers' church. She said the brothers had showed her angelic sights and told her fascinating things about heaven. However, while examining the infant, Dr. Morrison discovered that her eyes had started to acquire the same golden hue that was characteristic of Ezra's illness, and her fever had increased to 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Morrison was called in by the girl's parents, who were afraid that their daughter had contracted whatever had altered the boys. "You have to stop this," Thomas Preston, Sarah's father, said. "Those men, or whatever they've become, they're spreading their curse to our children. My little girl keeps talking about joining them in their holy work. She says they've shown her things that no 7-year-old should know about." After examining Sarah, Dr. Morrison concluded that her interactions with the brothers had had an impact on her. Her behavior had drastically changed, and her fever was not like typhoid or any other ailment he knew of. She seemed to radiate the same phosphorescence that defined Abel, spoke with a wisdom beyond her years, and showed an understanding of medical and theological principles that she could not have learned. Dr. Morrison made a choice that would follow him for the rest of his life when he realized that the brothers' illness might be communicable. He requested prompt action from the Regional Health Authority and the Kansas State Medical Board. However, the situation was so unsettling to the officials that came to look into it that they decided to suppress it rather than research it. In late October, State Medical Examiner Dr. James Patterson visited the Blackwood farm for 3 days. His official report, which was sealed by the state board, purportedly included findings that could have harmed public health and safety and were inconsistent with current medical knowledge. The report was classified and is still under wraps. However, years later, Patterson's private letters to his wife were found, exposing the full depth of his horror. "I have seen things," he stated, "that challenge not only our understanding of disease and human physiology, but the very nature of life itself." The Blackwood brothers are no longer entirely human, yet they are not dead. They exist in some intermediate state that our science cannot explain and dare not acknowledge. When other families claimed that their children had started to go missing from their beds at night and were discovered standing in the fields around the Blackwood Chapel hours later, the community's mounting anxiety about the brothers' prolonged presence reached a breaking point. The youngsters returned with skills and knowledge that severely troubled their parents, but they had no recollection of how they got there. The tragedy in Cedar Ridge gets worse just when we think we've seen it all. Share this video with a buddy who likes dark mysteries if this narrative is making you shiver. Please click the like button to show your support for our work, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. Together, let's find out what occurs next. On October 25, Mayor William Harrison called a town meeting to discuss what many citizens perceived as an urgent situation that needed to be addressed right away. Nearly all of Cedar Ridge's adults attended the gathering, and the conversation showed that the community was sharply split between those who saw the brothers as hazardous influences and others who saw them as gifted healers. Despite being asked to offer a medical evaluation, Dr. Morrison's testimony simply served to increase the community's anxiety and uncertainty. He confessed that conventional medicine had no therapy for the brothers' condition, which he described as unlike anything in medical literature, and that their effects seemed to be extending to other residents. Morrison said to the gathered audience, "I have seen physiological changes in the Blackwood brothers that call into question our basic knowledge of human biology. Their vital signs are consistently abnormal, yet they show no signs of illness. Their capabilities exceed normal human limitations, yet they maintain lucid consciousness. I cannot classify their condition as a disease, because they are not suffering. I cannot call it an improvement, because it represents a fundamental alteration of human nature." The decision made at the end of the conference would have far-reaching effects. A group of local officials were assembled to visit the Blackwood property and insist that the brothers either undo the modifications they had made or vacate Cedar Ridge forever. The brothers would be given a week to react to the committee's ultimatum, which would be delivered by Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Thomas Preston, and Dr. Morrison. On November 1st, 1878, the delegation from Cedar Ridge arrived at the Blackwood farm under a gray sky that appeared to weigh down the prairie with the approaching winter. Together with Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, and Thomas Preston, Dr. Morrison rode, each man preoccupied with his own thoughts about the impending clash. From a distance, the farmhouse and its outbuildings seemed typical, but as the delegation approached, information became apparent that reaffirmed Morrison's increasing belief that the Blackwood property had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. Even though winter was drawing near, the wheat fields, which ought to have been harvested weeks earlier, were still tall and golden, grazing in exact patterns that created geometric shapes when observed from the road's elevation. The cattle in the pastures moved with an unnatural coordination. The chapel on the hill was the most eerie of them. Even in daylight, the limestone building appeared to pulse with a subtle luminosity, and voices could be heard coming from inside, not the well-known Methodist hymnal harmonies, but something much more intricate and unearthly. Young Sarah Preston answered the farmhouse door when the delegation knocked, startling her father into temporarily becoming silent. The daughter seemed healthy and content, but her skin had taken on the same translucent appearance as the brothers, and the golden specks in her eyes had become more noticeable. Sarah's voice had the harmonic undertones that had come to define the change. "Hello, Papa," she said. "The brothers have been expecting you. They're waiting in the chapel, and they're ready to answer all your questions." On the way to the chapel, the delegation encountered occurrences that made them question reality itself. The air surrounding them shimmered with patterns of light that looked like waves of heat, but were cool to the touch, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with subtle energy. Despite their natural tendency, birds flew in formations, forming geometric designs that altered and evolved as the men approached the hill. The four Blackwood brothers were standing in a perfect square around the altar, their bodies positioned with mathematical accuracy when they entered the chapel. The brothers had progressed to a point where, in contrast, their prior state appeared quite normal. Their skin had turned entirely transparent, exposing internal organs that didn't resemble the typical human body. Their eyes appeared to have depths beyond the realm of reality, like pools of liquid gold. Ezra responded, "Welcome," but it sounded as if all four of the brothers were speaking at once. "We have been expecting you, and we understand the concerns that have brought you here. You fear what we have become, and you worry about the effects our transformation is having on your community. These are reasonable fears, and we do not dismiss them lightly. In his capacity as Cedar Ridge's official spokesperson, Mayor Harrison issued the directive that the town had determined upon. Either the brothers would have to return to their regular human state, or they would have to permanently depart the area. The terror and uncertainty they had brought about were too much for the community to bear. "Mr. Mayor," replied Caleb, his voice echoing that of Ezra, "we understand your position, but we must tell you that what you ask is impossible. The transformation we have undergone cannot be reversed any more than a butterfly can return to being a caterpillar. We have moved beyond the boundaries of human existence, and there is no path that leads backward from where we now stand." In an effort to address the spiritual aspects of the brothers' predicament, Reverend Thorne contended that their metamorphosis was a deviation from God's original plan for human nature. He cited verses from the Bible that discussed the sacredness of the human form and the perils of pursuing knowledge beyond what God has given humanity. However, the brothers' answer called into question long-held beliefs about how human limitations and divine will interact. Speaking in a voice that seemed to reverberate from several realms at once, Josiah contended that their metamorphoses signified the realization of humanity's spiritual potential. Josiah's words were accompanied by patterns of light dancing across the chapel walls. "Reverend Thorne," he said, "you speak of God's design as if it were static and unchanging, but the scriptures themselves promise that human beings are destined for transformation and elevation. We have simply discovered the path that leads to that promised transformation." By claiming that the brothers' impact on other community members constituted a public health risk, Dr. Morrison made an effort to treat the medical aspects of their condition. However, the boys' reaction made clear the drawbacks of treating their ailment using traditional medical procedures. "We are no longer constrained by the limitations that those criteria were intended to measure, Dr. Morrison," Abel said, his glowing form creating shifting patterns of light throughout the chapel. "You have documented our transformation with admirable scientific precision, but you continue to evaluate us using criteria designed for ordinary human physiology." When Thomas Preston questioned the brothers about their influence on his daughter, the argument took a significant turn. The intellectual abstractions that had dominated the conversation were broken by his parents' despair. Preston responded, "I don't care about your theories and theology," in an emotionally charged voice. "I care about my little girl. She was normal and happy before you got your hands on her. Now she talks like an adult, knows things no child should know, and looks at me with eyes that seem to see right through to my soul. I want my daughter back the way she was." The boys' reaction demonstrated their empathy as well as the irreversibility of the changes they had started. They clarified that Josiah's prayer over Timothy Fletcher months prior was the catalyst for Sarah's metamorphosis, not her visit to their chapel. An unbreakable bond had been formed by that prayer. "Thomas," said Ezra in a gentle voice, "your daughter is not lost to you. She is becoming something that will serve purposes far greater than anything she could achieve within the limitations of ordinary human existence. The love you feel for her will continue to bind you together, even as she evolves beyond normal human classification." The solution that none of the adults had been able to come up with, however, was Sarah herself. She took the stage and spoke to the group in a way that seemed unthinkable for someone her age. "Papa, Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Dr. Morrison," she said in a young voice that conveyed complete honesty, "you're asking the wrong questions. You want to know if what's happening to us is good or bad, safe or dangerous, right or wrong. But those categories don't apply to what we're becoming. We're not better or worse than we were before. We're different in ways that make such comparisons meaningless." In order to establish that their metamorphosis signified growth rather than loss, the brothers then promised to show off their powers. Despite his concern, Dr. Morrison consented to the demonstration because he was curious in science. The evidence that Morrison would have to live with for the rest of his life came from what transpired next. The brothers positioned themselves around the delegation and started what they referred to as a consciousness bridge, a procedure that gave regular people a brief glimpse of the heightened awareness that had become their marebone, enduring state. Morrison lived reality through the eyes of the boys for a few minutes that felt like hours. He could discern connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, that demonstrated the fundamental unity of all things, see events taking place hundreds of miles away, and sense the thoughts and feelings of every individual in Cedar Ridge. It provided knowledge that no human mind was built to hold, and it was both thrilling and terrible. Morrison was altered in ways that would impact him for the rest of his life after the event was over. In addition to discovering that certain knowledge was too enormous for the average human consciousness to safely grasp, he had also witnessed evidence that reality was far more complex than orthodox science recognized. Similar experiences were shared by the other delegation members, but the demonstration also made clear the cost of such expansion. As their regular consciousness strained to assimilate information that was beyond its capacity, each individual had moments of bewilderment. Dr. Morrison's covert examination of the Blackwood brothers' blood samples beneath his microscope ultimately exposed the truth about them. He discovered entities that defied classification in place of typical cells, larger than usual, with many nuclei, and moving purposefully. With an agitated handwriting style, Morrison wrote, "The blood is alive, not merely containing life, but possessing consciousness that coordinates cellular activities. It's as if their entire circulatory system has become a single thinking organism." Morrison learned that the brothers had been changed by typhoid disease, not cured. Their basic biology had changed as a result of the sickness, which had caused some sort of evolutionary adaptation. Between life and death, their bodies had transformed into something new. From the start, the brothers disclosed, their metamorphosis had been deliberate. Using information gleaned from theological research, Josiah had planned his prayer over Timothy Fletcher. In order to attain unity with the eternal, they had discovered references to divine communion necessitating the total surrender of human body. The words, "We are not dying," came from Caleb. "We are becoming. This flesh is merely a cocoon, and we are emerging as something far greater." The brothers disclosed that they had made touch with others who were similar to them throughout history, people who had experienced comparable changes. They described a system of purified vessels, preparing humanity for a significant shift. Morrison came to the realization that the brothers had transformed into something that was not human, not dead, but not living in the conventional sense. Because they questioned basic beliefs about life and death, they resided in a state that medical science was unable to recognize. When Abel murmured, "You can join us," his phosphorescent skin pulsed with invitation. Your scientific mind would be preserved and enhanced. However, Morrison decided to be human when given the option between transcendence and humanity. Desperate from sheer dread, he drove through the darkness to escape the chapel. The narrative of the Blackwood brothers began to come to an end with Dr. Morrison's departure from Cedar Ridge. Unable to handle what he had seen, Morrison burned his diaries, ruined all his research, and permanently fled Kansas. He never mentioned the Blackwood case to anybody after relocating to Oregon, where he continued to practice medicine for another 30 years. It appeared as though the brothers themselves realized that their presence was no longer acceptable to the human population they had previously served. They started avoiding all communication with their neighbors in the weeks after Morrison left. After months of being visible across the plains, the lights of their chapel went out. There was a pause in the odd melodies that had come from their nightly prayers. The first body was discovered by Thomas Preston on the 15th of December, 1878. As he lay in the chapel, Ezra's changed body was already starting to break down in ways that were unknown to biology. His skin had become the color of old parchment, and his bright eyes had become glass. He had just stopped existing. There was no apparent reason why. Over the next several days, the other brothers were discovered, each in a separate part of the farm. A circle of grain that had grown to impossibly high heights overnight encircled Caleb's body when he was found in the wheat fields. Josiah was discovered sitting at his desk in the farmhouse library, a blank page in front of him and a pen in his hand. Abel was found in the barn, still gleaming dimly in the dark from his phosphorescent skin. Eager to disassociate itself from the matter, the Methodist Church made arrangements for the boy's speedy and private burial in the chapel's tiny cemetery. Simple stones with names and dates were used to mark the graves. No autopsy was conducted, and no formal cause of death was noted. However, The Blackwood brothers' mystery did not go away when they passed away. The chapel deteriorated, and the farm was deserted in the years that followed. However, on quiet nights, travelers reported hearing melodious voices resonating across the grassland and seeing unusual lights coming from the mountaintop. The sealed report on the case from the Kansas State Medical Board is still classified. No one questioned Dr. Patterson's suggestion that the issue be put on hold indefinitely for the sake of public health and scientific integrity. The official stance is that any claims of strange symptoms were the product of mass hysteria caused by the outbreak, and that the Blackwood brothers died from complications related to typhoid disease. A development business bought the abandoned Blackwood farm in 1923 with plans to construct a new town there. However, citing extreme fear and uncanny visions, construction workers refused to work close to the church ruins. The area was finally given to the state as a nature preserve when the project was shelved. Officially, the area is closed to the public because of environmental concerns, but locals are aware of the true motivation. Even though the Blackwood brothers' metamorphosis came to an end with their passing, those who are aware of the whole narrative are still troubled by the issues they brought up regarding the nature of human existence, the distinction between life and death, and the potential for transcendence via self-surrendering. The Blackwood case is still not accepted by modern science, not because there is insufficient proof, but rather because the ramifications are too upsetting to consider. We need to rethink biology, awareness, and the essence of existence itself if the brothers' metamorphosis was genuine, if they actually evolved into something that defies human categorization. In actuality, some mysteries are too risky to unravel, and some information is too awful to own. By finding a way to transcend that necessitated giving up all of their humanity, the Blackwood brothers transformed into something that human civilization could neither comprehend nor embrace. Their tale serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of pursuing knowledge beyond human capacity. They allowed forces to change them into something that was neither totally alive nor entirely dead because they wanted to communicate with the divine directly and avoid the constraints of human existence. The hilltop chapel is now deserted, its doors sealed, and its windows dark. However, on some nights when the moon is dark and the wind is silent, travelers claim to have seen 4 people standing in the wheat fields with their faces turned to the sky as though they were listening to a voice in the distance. We do know, however, that the Blackwood brothers' search for spiritual connection brought them to a place that neither religion nor science can map. They became living examples of the irrevocable alterations and thresholds that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. This enigma demonstrates that the lines separating human and divine, as well as between life and death, may be far more pliable than we think. The Blackwood brothers managed to break through such barriers, but at the cost of their humanity. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think it was all revealed? Post your thoughts about what you believe actually occurred to the 4 boys in the comments section below. Please hit the notification bell, subscribe, and tell a mystery-loving friend if you liked this story and would like to see more horror tales like it. For those who have the courage to pursue it, the truth is waiting for them. I'll see you in the upcoming video.